Hello knowledge seekers, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today this is my second lecture of our English literature series. In our first lecture we have discussed the UGC NEET English literature syllabus, introduced the different areas that we are going to cover, and talked about how we will approach the entire UGC NEET paper 2 syllabus. So today we are going to begin our actual journey through the history of English literature. So before we study individual writers and text, it is extremely important to understand the different periods or ages of English literature. So, you can think of the history of English literature as a journey. Different historical periods have different political conditions, social structures, intellectual movement, literary characteristics, important writers, and so on. So, in today's lecture, we will create a timeline of English literature. So, a complete chronological guide through major literary periods. So, majorly periods are divided in 8 major parts. So, we will start from 450 AD to present day contemporary. Okay, so let's move to our next slide. So, this is chronological roadmap, that is overview. Okay, major periods of English literature. Broadly, we can divide the history of English literature into the following periods. Okay, so this is major division. These periods are major one. Okay, so first one is Old English period, that is from 450 to 1066 AD. Then Middle English period, that is from 1066 to 1500. Then comes Renaissance, okay, that is 1500 to 1660, but in between there is subdivisions which we will study later on. Okay, and neoclassical is, then romantic is, and Victorian is, modern and postmodern. So let's move to our next slide. Let's start with Old English period. Okay, please remember that these dates are approximate. Literary periods do not begin and end suddenly on a particular day. Okay, they overlap with one another. For UGC NEET, however, these broad divisions are extremely useful because in exams they used to ask questions. They used to ask tenure, romantic periods begin from, or what is the tenure of Elizabethan periods, or many questions comes from these periods. So, firstly, we will start with Old English period. Old English period starts with 450 AD to 1066. Okay, so historical origin begin around 450 AD with the arrival of Germanic tribes. Okay, so these tribes came from Germany, that is Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They come in Britain. They invaded Britain actually. So mainly core literary characteristics are focused on heroism, warfare, tribal loyalty, faith, religious influence, strong oral tradition. And if you talk about literature, so in this period, mainly Old English period, from Old English period, major literary work is Beowulf, the most celebrated heroic epic poem in Old English. So the major period in the Old English period also called the Anglo-Saxon period. Okay, so Old English period is also called Anglo-Saxon period. It begins around 450 when Germanic tribes such as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes came to Britain. The most important work associated with this period is, as I said, Beowulf. Beowulf is an epic poem and is one of the most important texts in Old English literature. And some important characteristics of Old English literature are heroism, warfare, loyalty, faith, religious influence, and oral tradition. So the language of this period is very different from the English that we speak today. So the period ends traditionally in 1066 with the Norman conquest. This is very important for your exam, Norman conquest. Okay, so next, Middle English period. It begins from 1066 and up to 1500. So the year 1066 is extremely important. Okay, the next period is Middle English period, and here is very important. the Norman conquest. William Duke of Normandy defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings. This is very important. Okay, so please remember this Battle of Hastings. It is called Norman conquest. Okay, so French become the language of court and nobility, blending with Anglo-Saxon to form Middle English. After the Norman conquest, actually French became extremely influential in England, particularly among the ruling class. So French become very influential. So English gradually developed into what we call Middle English. The greatest writer, you all must have heard this name. So the greatest writer of this period is of course Geoffrey Chaucer. Okay, so he wrote the Canterbury Tales, and because of Geoffrey Chaucer, we also call Chaucerian age. So we will study this when we will start studying this is in depth. This is just overview. Okay, so when we start studying in depth one by one all ages, at that time I will teach you this all. So, and Geoffrey Chaucer is most famous for his magnum opus, that is the Canterbury Tales. He has written a number of works, but he is mainly famous for this Canterbury Tales. And other important works and writers include like William Langland, his famous work Piers Plowman, Sir Gawain and this Green Knight, and John Gower. So we will study these writers one by one in our further lectures. Okay, so let's come to the next period, that is the Renaissance. Okay, so Renaissance, what is the meaning of Renaissance? It is rebirth, revival. So rebirth, revival, Renaissance, rebirth of what? Revival of classical Greek and Roman learning, focused on humanism, individualism, science, art, philosophy, and global exploration. So it is one of the most important periods for English literature, and it particularly refers to the revival of classical Greek and Roman learning, art, and culture. For English literature, the Renaissance produced some of the greatest writers in English, and actually these are the four subdivisions of the Renaissance period. Okay, so first one is Elizabethan age, that is 1558 to 1600. Then that is reign of Queen Elizabeth. Then Jacobean age. Jacobean age comes from 1603 to 1625. Then Caroline age, and then Puritan age. It is also known as the Commonwealth. So this is the periods. They all come under one umbrella, that is Renaissance period. And the greatest literary figures of this age include William Shakespeare, of course, and because of William Shakespeare we also call this age Shakespearean age at some time, so we will read this later on. Okay, so William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, Francis Bacon, John Milton. So Jacobean age, Elizabethan age because of Queen Elizabeth, Jacobean age, King James I. Okay, and then Caroline age, Charles his son, and then comes Puritan age. Okay, and the metaphysical poets, particularly John Donne, become very important in this period, that is Jacobean period. So after Commonwealth or Puritan age, then come this is Renaissance services, that is associated with Queen Elizabeth I, peak of English drama and lyrical poetry, and Elizabethan age prominent writers William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, Philip Sidney, and these are their famous works. We will study these works also. So Jacobean and later is followed by Caroline and Puritan. We have studied this in the previous slide. So metaphysical poets, Ben Jonson, Francis Bacon, John Milton. So he is famous for his Paradise Lost, and we will also cover this later when we will study, that is Puritan age. Okay, so then comes Neoclassical age, or with 1660 it is Restoration. Why it is Restoration? So actually this Commonwealth periods or Puritan age, during this age there was no king, so again monarchy restored, that is why this is Restoration age. At that time there was no king in the Britain, but again here Restoration, kingship restored, Restoration age. Okay, so begin with restoration of Charles II. In Caroline age, Charles I was the king. So in Restoration age is again Charles II. And theatre reopens. During Puritan age, Puritanism. Actually, Puritans believe in purity. They tried to abandon all luxuries or all, material things. Theatre Pains and John Dryden, William Congreve, and other writers were famous writer of the stage. So this is 1662 1700. Then 1772 1745 it is Augustines. Augustines at this time the most prominent famous writer was Alexander Pope, and satire becomes particularly very important genre of literature at that time. So logic and classical imitations, and Jonathan Swift is also important writer of this is, and the Age of Johnson, that is 1745 to 1798. Also sometimes we call it pre-romantic age. Pre-romantic age. So I'll teach you all this when we will cover the ages one by one in details. Okay. So Samuel Johnson was the dominated writer, prominent writer of this time, and many other writers also. But this period is 1745 to 1798. Then let's move to our next slide. That is Romantic period. Begin from 1798 with the publication of, yes, most famous work, that is publication of Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. These are the famous romantic writers, and remember this important date, that is 1798. So core value, that is nature, imagination, emotion, individualism, freedom, common man language, day-to-day language. These are very important characteristics of romantic literature. Okay, so and major romantic writers were they, like William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge. So I've divided them in two generation. Actually, it is not divided by me, it is divided by scholars. So first generation poets, William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, and William Blake. Second generation poets, Lord Byron, B.B. Shelley, and John Keats. So we will read about these writers one by one in details because they are very important, and this age is also very important. So then let's move to Victorian age. Victorian period. Start with reign of Queen Victoria, that is 1837 to 1901. So the Victorian period begins with the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837 and ends with her death in 1901. This is a very important period for the development of the English novel. The Victorian age was characterized by industrialization, urbanization, social change, class conflict, poverty, religious thought, scientific development, moral concerns. So fiction became the dominant literary genre, addressing social reforms. Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, they were very important writers of this age. So if you talk about poetry and drama, Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Oscar Wilde, they're also good name. And then after Victorian period, we come to modern period. That is from 1901 to 1945. So after the Victorian period, we enter the modern period. Modern literature reflects the uncertainties and crises of the 20th century and important events that were happening at that time: World War I, World War II, industrial and technological development, changing social values, decline of traditional beliefs. Modernist writers experimented with new literary techniques. Important characteristics like fragmentation, then stream of consciousness, disillusionment, multiple perspective, experimentation, myth, and major writers of this period is T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf, very important, W.B. Yeats, and many more. We will read them when we will cover this modern age. So now move to next slide, that is post-modern, that is also called contemporary age, 1945 to present day. So post-modern or contemporary period. After the Second World War, literature became increasingly diverse and experimental. Postmodern literature often questions absolute truth, fixed identity, grand narratives, traditional literary forms, stable meanings, and characteristics, that is important characteristics: fragmentation, intertextuality, irony, pastiche. You must be thinking, what is irony, what is pastiche? I'll teach you all this in our upcoming classes. So, and important writers are like Kazuo Ishiguro, J.D. Smith, Ivan McEwan, Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, Salman Rushdie. So contemporary English literature has also become increasingly multicultural and global. Writers from different cultural backgrounds have contributed significantly to English literature. Before we finish today's lecture, let's revise the entire timeline once again. Old English period, Middle English, Renaissance, Neoclassical, Romantics, Victorian, Modern, and Post Modern. So that is all for today. In our next class, I'll start with Old English period. So stay connected, stay tuned. If you like my lecture, please subscribe to my channel and let's meet in the next class. Thanks for watching.